As far as the soil preparation is concerned, if you had allowed the patch just to go to weeds over the winter and you didn't do anything like grow vegetables or grow cover crops, well, then you're going to have to get out there, remove the winter weeds. Hopefully they didn't seed all over on you. That's the biggest problem of letting it go in the winter, is the seeds. They'll haunt you forever, dozens and dozens of years. They come back if you let the weeds seed. But if you had weeds, you remove the weeds, then go through, and generally we'll dig the soil by hand or with a tiller, or have somebody come till it. Apply compost to the earth. Always apply compost. Don't go in and start digging and doing anything in the garden without putting in more organic matter. The climate we have here eats organic matter like kids eat M&Ms. It's just gone. I don't know if anybody's ever noticed this. Anybody mulch much? You know, I mean, under my citrus trees, I'm forever throwing everything I can find. Okay, I mean, I cut down a banana patch. I threw all the banana plants under the citrus. I got a straw bale that goes under the citrus. Whatever it is, it gets piled under there. And I didn't put anything in for about 12 months. And the other day, I went walking under my citrus, and I looked and I went, "It's bare dirt. Where did it all go?" It was completely eaten by the environment. Watch this sometime. Do this. Throw organic matter at the earth and watch and see what happens to it here. And generally speaking, Fremont has what I call an organic deficit, because you got these mow and blow guys, and the more money you have, the more mow and blow guys you have more often, who come through and blow away every speck of organic matter out the soil. Okay? And they do it constantly. And so you really do need to replenish it. So get some compost, work that into the ground. You don't have to put compost in deep. I seldom work compost into the soil more than 4 inches. I've seen people dig it in by feet down. It's not a good idea, because compost is an organic material, and if you put it too deep in the soil, you get below the aerobic zone where the air is at, and the compost begins to decompose anaerobically, and then it'll produce hydrogen sulfide and methane, which are not good. Either that, or it completely locks into carbon and eventually becomes peat or coal down that far. But anyway, so get some compost and then spread an organic fertilizer with it. If you did have a cover crop out there, then you probably want to till it in, wait a couple of weeks before you go and start to plant into it. Usually we let the stuff rot a bit in the soil, it's typical. You can facilitate the rotting of the cover crop by throwing some chicken manure, some organic fertilizer, something to stimulate the microbial activity in the soil. Will make the cover crop just turn into humus, just like that. Otherwise, if you're like me, I just cut the cover crop, I let it lay as a mulch, I go out and I stick the plants in it. I don't dig. Digging is not part of my regime when it comes to gardening. Only dig for other people, never dig for me. Okay, it's generally speaking, in nature, everything is always falling on the surface of the soil, metabolizing and working its way in. The only time anything gets dug in nature is when a woodchuck or a gopher comes by and starts to work at it. Then it's a little bit of this cultivation and digging. It's not totally unnatural, but in general, everything applies to the top. And that's where most of it works the best. But if you're using an organic fertilizer, make sure that you're putting it under a mulch or under the surface of the soil a little bit, because most of those don't work well if they're exposed to sunlight. Okay? They won't function out there. They need to be in contact with moisture. Otherwise, another thing you can consider doing too, we had the question about watermelons, plastic mulches, and this is something to think of this year because they do minimize evaporation of moisture, and we're going to be dealing with worrying about where the water's coming from this year. And so consider trying to grow warm, really warm loving crops like watermelons, cantaloupes, or eggplants. Those are all real heat lovers. Try growing in some black plastic. Prepare your soil, unroll black plastic over it, cut slits in it, stick the plants right in through the slits. It will keep the weeds from growing. It'll hold in a little bit extra moisture that you won't be using, and the heat from the black plastic will stimulate the growth of the warm season plants. Oh, and as far as the soil preparation and the timing, this is connected. Start planting before the soil moisture begins to retreat too deep this year. That's a key. Look at soil moisture here as being whatever we got in the winter was all the water that we're actually naturally ever going to get. Okay, and that water gets into the earth, and as summer moves in, it trickles downward into the soil. It's slowly settling down to the water table, right? Which keeps getting lower all the time. But when the soil moisture, like right now, is still at the surface, if you begin to apply irrigation before the moisture goes downward, then you'll maintain capillary action between the water you put on top and the stuff that's down below. If you let it go down here so that it's dry on the top and dry a foot down, say, you'll probably never get enough water on the top to connect to the water molecules below to create a chain. Water moves up and down in soil, not just down. It does move up because water on the top draws water upward. Okay, and so when it's dry like this, start watering early, because if you let it dry out before you start, you're always going to have a lens of dust between where the soil moisture is at and where you're watering. You actually use less water. Also, connected to that again, if you haven't been a person that uses a mulch on your garden, whether it's a plastic mulch or it's a compost mulch or whether it's straw bales or whatever it is, this is the year. Get used to it. Start using a mulch. I don't use much mulch in the winter time around here because we get frosty nights, and on frosty nights, if you got a lot of mulch over the soil, the heat won't escape around your crops. And so sometimes you can even freeze a cabbage plant around here if the ground is heavily mulched. But in the summertime, it's the reverse. You want to keep the earth completely covered with some kind of a material, and I at least 3-4 inches of this stuff is best. I've always told people mulch around your tomatoes, for instance, because people get the black ends on the tomatoes, the blossom end rot. Most of that's caused by your regular watering cycle.
But it doesn't do any good to mulch vegetables in the winter time.
It's not that it doesn't do any good, but it can be counterproductive because sun heats soil, and if your soil is exposed, somewhat airy, and especially if it's textured a little bit, then that will allow the sun to hit it and actually warm the soil up a little bit more than it naturally might. And if you have the soil covered with bales of straw, it won't warm, and at night when it gets really cold, say it drops to 20 degrees, the heat in the soil escaping at night moves around your plants. It'll keep the temperature around your broccoli or your peas or something a little bit higher. If you mulch it, that heat never comes out of the soil at all, and you can wake up in the morning and find a whole row of peas dead. It can actually happen. I've done it. Personal experience. Killed them with kindness. Your vegetables will grow much slower in the wintertime if they're mulched than if they're not mulched, because the soil will heat up better around them if it's exposed.
I wanted to ask you about the water.
Yeah.
How do you know how far down the water is?
Yeah, well, if you're mulching in the summer, it's pretty simple.
No, like you say, okay, after the winter, we don't want to let the soil dry out too much.
Right.
So how do we know when to start watering if we've had a certain amount of
Well,
water?
I just, rough guess with the way the climate looks this year, I'd probably be starting my watering this year in March.
Okay.
Usually I'll start in April. Okay, by the middle of April, soil moisture is when the rain stops. As soon as the rain stops, the water starts going down. Okay, and so say in April you're putting in the tomatoes and all this stuff, and so you start to put mulches down around to keep the moisture in. If you go out into the garden in May and you kick aside your mulch, and you look down and you don't see any water on the surface, if you can dig in about a knuckle or an inch or so, and if you can't feel water below the mulch, an inch down in the soil, it's time to start watering, because your water is beginning to retreat downward. And when you do water, you don't want just this little stuff. That isn't going to work. You really need to put down enough water to be able to connect with the water